By the end of this lecture, you're going to understand how to configure the Angular testbed in order to test routing. And you're also going to understand how to write test specs that involve routing. So in order to test routing, I've created a very simple application in our Plunker here. We have a few components and a root configuration. So I have a search component, a home component, a main app component which contains a router outlet, and I have a very basic root configuration where we have the empty path redirecting to home, the home path shows the home component, and the search path shows the search component. And if we go into the router specification file, we can see we're importing the different components and the routes from the router. And I just have a very basic testbed configuration at the bottom here, where I'm just declaring the 3 different components. So normally to set up routing in an Angular application, we import the router module and provide the routes to the ng module with router module with routes function, and we pass in the routes. However, when testing routing, we use the router testing module instead. And this module sets up the router with a SPI implementation of the location strategy that doesn't actually change the URL whenever we route to different pages. So firstly, I need to add our router testing module to our imports, like so. So router testing module, so normally it's router module, but for testing purposes, we use the router testing module with routes function, and then we pass in the routes that we've imported from our router. And again, router testing module comes from the Angular router testing module there. And then we grab a reference to the injected router from our testbed. And we also grab a reference to the injected location strategy. Now, in order to implement routing, we need to have some component with a router outlet, and that's our root app component. So we ask the testbed to create our root app component. And then we need to call a special function called router.initialNavigation. This sets up the location change listener and performs the initial navigation. We've now got everything set up and we're ready to create our test specs. So if you're looking at our root configuration again, we've set it up so landing on an empty URL redirects us to the home path. Let's add a test spec for this. Go back into my test spec file. So again, routing is an asynchronous activity. So I'm going to use one of the asynchronous testing methods. And in this case, I'm going to use the fake async method. Now we already have an instance or reference to the router from our before each function. And I'm just going to trigger the router to navigate to the empty path here. Now again, routing is asynchronous. So we now need to wait for all the pending promises and asynchronous work to finish. So I'm going to call the tick function. And then we can inspect to find out what the URL would be by calling location.path. Now this doesn't actually change the URL because we're using a special version of the location strategy. That's the thing that's set up by the router testing module. But we can check to see what would be the path by calling location.path. And we expect that to be home. And actually there's a bit of a mistake here. I just need to add another brackets at the end here. And now this is ready. If we run this, and there we go. Our first test spec is passing. And then adding in other test specs for other routes is pretty simple. We can add one in for our search route. So if we navigate to search, I expect the URL to change to /search. So if we now run this, it again works as expected, the test pass. So to summarize, we can test routing in Angular by using a router testing module instead of a router module to provide our routes. This uses a SPY implementation of location, which doesn't trigger a request for a new URL, but does let us know the target URL, which we can use in our test specs.